My son informed me that he was going to the cemetery to visit his father. Therefore, I discreetly followed him to place some flowers. Upon my arrival, the groundskeeper approached me and quietly advised, "Do not go to that grave. You must see what he is truly doing." 1 hour later. Hello, esteemed listeners. Thank you for joining me today. If you appreciate stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. I am always interested to know where in the world you are tuning in from. Please share your city in the comments. Enjoy the story. The dust in my apartment seems to have a life of its own. I observe it swirling in the beams of morning sunlight that penetrate through the heavy velvet curtains. It dances in a slow, silent motion, settling on the spines of the books that occupy every shelf and floor-to-ceiling rack. This is not merely my library. It belongs to my late husband, Kwame, and I serve as its curator. It has been 5 years since his passing, and today marks the exact anniversary. The apartment is shared space. Everything here resonates with his essence, his habits, his brilliance. His large, dark mahogany desk occupies the center of the living room, and his armchair bears a permanent indentation from years of scholarly work. My own small corner, a writing desk by the window cluttered with geranium pots, is now enveloped in the same layer of dust as everything else. I have not opened the drawer containing my tools, my former tools, in 30 years. The morning of the anniversary always drags on, thick like molasses. I brewed some tea and sat at the kitchen table. The mug in my hands was slightly warm, yet I felt a coldness radiating from deep within. This sensation is familiar whenever I await the arrival of my son, Jabari, and his wife, Niara. The doorbell rang sharply, breaking the library's stillness. I recognized it was them. They always visit on the anniversary, not out of grief, but for an opportunity to discuss finances. "Hey, Mama." Jabari's voice burst into the hallway, loud and deliberately cheerful. He embraced me awkwardly, his prickly cheeks brushing against mine. He carried the scent of expensive cologne and anxiety. Niara followed him like a shadow, her face adorned with a meticulously crafted expression of sorrow. She nodded silently and glided into the living room, her eyes immediately darting toward the bookshelves. She had never appreciated these books, once muttering, "Just collections," as if she thought I couldn't hear. "Would you like some tea?" I inquired, heading into the kitchen. "We could really use something stronger, Ma," Jabari sighed, collapsing heavily into his father's armchair. He always did that, sitting in Kwame's chair as if attempting to wear a life that didn't belong to him. "Things are going from bad to worse," he continued. I poured the tea in silence, familiar with this prelude. Now would come the complaints about unreliable business partners, customs duties suffocating them, and their vague import-export venture that seemed to yield nothing but debt. "That container is stuck at the port of Charleston. Can you believe it?" Niara interjected, her voice tinged with a carefully performed desperation. "The merchandise is worth so much, around $200,000. We need to make an emergency deposit or we risk losing everything, all our investment." She looked directly at me, unflinching, the gaze of a predator calculating how much more could be extracted from a seemingly useless old relative. "We didn't want to bother you, Ma, especially today." Jabari lowered his voice, feigning delicacy. "But the situation is critical. We need financial assistance." Nothing stirred within me. In the past, I might have felt a pang of pity or guilt. However, over the past 5 years, something had burned away, leaving behind only dry, bitter ash. I looked at my 40-year-old son, his face already etched with a network of wrinkles from constant dissatisfaction, and failed to recognize the boy whose scraped knees I once kissed better. "I'll think about it, Jabari," I replied quietly. "I need to check what I have." He pursed his lips in annoyance. Niara shot him a quick, angry glance. They had been counting on immediate consent, on that blind maternal love that forgives all and gives everything. Suddenly, Jabari stood, walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, just as his father used to do. But in him, there was none of his father's stature, only a cheap imitation. He stood like that for a minute, then turned. His eyes were moist. I recognized this tactic. He had used it since childhood when he desperately wanted something. 5 years, he said, his voice trembling. 5 years since Pop left, and I still feel like he's about to walk through that door. "I'm going to the cemetery. I need to sit there alone, talk to him. A single artfully deployed tear rolled down his cheek. Niara watched him with barely concealed admiration. Now that's a winning move, I thought, and I fell for it. In that moment, all my knowledge of him, all the bitter experiences of the last few years, retreated. Somewhere deep inside, in that forgotten corner where hope still resided, a warmth stirred. What if? What if there truly is something human left in him? What if the memory of his father is not just an empty phrase? This thought was so welcome, so sweet, that I clung to it like a drowning person to a straw. The yearning for sincerity, for any sign of a son's love, was stronger than common sense. "That's good, Jabari," I whispered, my voice genuinely trembling. "That's very good." He nodded, wiped the tear, and quickly headed for the exit, as if afraid I might notice the deception. Nayara lingered for a moment to seal the effect. "He's taking it so hard, Miss Johnson," she cooed, using my late husband's surname. "He loved his father so much, he just doesn't show it." As she left, I was left alone in the deafening silence, broken only by the ticking clock. That warmth, that timid hope began to grow within me. I suddenly felt a desperate desire to see him, to see my son at his father's grave, alone in silence and sorrow, not to catch him or verify his actions, but to believe, to feel, if only for a moment, that we were a family connected by shared memories. I quickly changed, taking 3 deep red carnations from the vase, the ones I had purchased that morning for Kwame's portrait. I called a cab to the next street over to avoid being seen. Throughout the ride, I envisioned arriving, standing hidden behind an old oak tree, and seeing him with his head bowed at the family mausoleum. Perhaps then I would find the strength to help him one last time. Pine Ridge Cemetery greeted me with cool tranquility and the rustling of old trees. The air carried the scent of decaying leaves and peace. I walked along the familiar gravel path leading to our family crypt. My heart pounded with excitement and hope. I could already see the massive granite gates of the mausoleum in the distance when a tall, stooped man in work clothes emerged from around a corner and approached me. It was Ephraim, the groundskeeper. He had worked here for at least 10 years. Kwame had once aided him, either with housing or employment. I could not recall the details. We always exchanged silent nods, but today he did not nod. He approached me directly, and something in his eyes covered my hope with a layer of ice. His face, usually placid, now resembled a severe mask. He walked almost up to me. I halted, clutching the carnations. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but each word pierced my consciousness like a shard of glass. "Hello, Ephraim," I replied, attempting a smile. "I'm going to see my husband, and my son is here somewhere." He interrupted me, placing his rough, calloused palm on my shoulder. I didn't feel it because at that moment he looked me straight in the eye, and a chill ran down my spine. "Ava," he whispered so softly I barely heard. His face was tense and grim. "Do not go to the crypt, please. Not right now. Wait. You need to see what he is really doing." Ephraim's words did not instill fear or provoke a desire to argue. They simply fell into the ringing void that had opened within me. The carnations in my hand suddenly felt foreign, lifeless. I nodded silently. I did not inquire why or what he meant. I already knew I would not like the answer. He turned and, without looking back, walked away from the main avenue along a barely visible path overgrown with weeds. I followed him like a sleepwalker. We walked in complete silence, the only sounds being our footsteps rustling through the dry leaves and the distant, mournful cry of a crow. He led me to a small hill, to an old leaning fence surrounding a long-forgotten grave. From here, through the dense branches of wild lilac, our family crypt was visible as if in plain sight, somber and majestic, made of black granite. It appeared as an unshakable monument to the honor and dignity of the Johnson lineage. "You can see everything from here, and they can't see us," Ephraim said softly, then moved aside toward a tree, granting me space at the fence. He seemed to understand that this was something I needed to witness alone. I gripped the cold metal of the fence. I did not have to wait long, less than 5 minutes. 2 figures appeared from the main avenue, Jabari and Niara. My son was not alone. He had not come to talk to his father. He had brought his wife. They were not carrying flowers. Their strides were brisk and businesslike, devoid of sorrow, no pause at the entrance to cross themselves or simply stand in silence. Jabari produced a set of keys from his pocket and inserted one, large and antique, into the keyhole of the crypt's heavy wrought iron door. A loud grinding sound echoed through the cemetery's silence as the door groaned open. They entered as if it were not a tomb, but a storage unit, an ordinary garage. The cold within me, which had previously been a mere premonition, began to gain density, becoming solid and heavy. I watched, unable to look away, as if my eyelids were frozen in place. A few moments later, a third person approached the crypt, a man in a long, dark coat, despite the relatively warm day. I could not see his face. He remained in the shadows, yet his entire figure radiated something unpleasant and slick. He did not greet them. He merely peered inside and spoke briefly. Then I observed the movement. Jabari and Niara emerged, carrying objects in their hands, items carefully wrapped in dark velvet, one elongated, the other almost square. They handed them to the man. I did not know what they were, but the manner in which they did it, quickly looking around nervously, spoke volumes. The wind carried snippets of their conversation to me. Their voices were low but distinct in the dead silence. "Flawless forgery," the stranger remarked, slightly lifting the edge of the velvet. "A pro couldn't spot it." "I told you the master wouldn't let us down," my son replied, a note of pride in his voice. "This isn't cheap knockoff stuff." "And the museum? Is everything smooth with the Atlanta Museum of Art?" Nyara inquired, her voice sharp with greed. "The museum director, old fool. He's desperate for this 15th century Psalter for his collection." Jabari chuckled. "He'll swallow it whole and won't choke. The main thing is your people need to provide the right documents to indicate it was a found treasure." In that moment, everything changed forever. The warmth, the maternal warmth I had nurtured for 40 years, the warmth that made me forgive lies, cover debts, and believe in tears of repentance, did not fade. It vanished instantly, like a flash of lightning, turning a living tree into charred stone. In my chest, where love for my son once resided, a block of ice formed. No, not ice, something denser, heavier, compressed from disappointment and 40 years of foolishness. It was not even hatred. Hatred is a feeling that requires energy. This was cold, crystalline clarity and boundless sorrow. They were not merely thieves, they were desecrators. They had transformed his father's grave, my husband's crypt, into a fence's warehouse. Kwame had dedicated his entire life to the study of history and the preservation of originals. He despised falsehood in all its forms, and his own son, his flesh and blood, was using his ashes to cover up the trade of fakes. It was sacrilege of such magnitude that my mind struggled to comprehend it fully. I did not cry. No tears came. They seemed to freeze before reaching the surface. The man in the coat nodded, took the bundles, and disappeared just as swiftly. Jabari and Niara glanced inside once more, adjusted something, and then, with the same grinding sound, closed and locked the door, leaving without laying a single flower. I do not recall saying goodbye to Ephraim. I think I merely nodded at him and walked away. He said nothing, and I was grateful for that. I meandered along the paths, past the crosses and obelisks, seeing nothing. I moved automatically, exited the cemetery gates, caught a cab, and provided my address. The entire ride home, I stared out the window at the flashing houses, trees, and people, feeling as if I were encased in a glass bell. The world existed somewhere outside, while I remained in a soundless, cold void. Upon entering the apartment, I halted in the entryway. The air was thick with the scent of books, old paper, and his tobacco, which seemed as if it would never dissipate. I walked slowly into the living room, past his desk, past his armchair, past the rack filled with the fruits of his life. Everything suddenly appeared like a meticulously arranged set, beautiful, majestic, yet lifeless. My gaze fell upon my corner, the small writing desk by the window, cluttered with old receipts, my dusty, forgotten space. I approached it slowly, as if performing a ritual, drawing my finger across the dusty lid before pulling open the bottom drawer. It yielded with difficulty, screeching. Inside, beneath a stack of time-worn papers, lay a simple wooden box, unadorned. The tiny bronze key had always hung on a chain around my neck beneath my clothing, next to my cross, a reflexive habit from the days when the contents of this box represented my life. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. Click. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark green velvet, lay my tools. They had not tarnished. A small yet powerful jeweler's loupe, a compact metal-cased ultraviolet lamp, a set of fine tweezers and scalpels. Beneath them, in a lower compartment, lay 3 thin, hardcover volumes. My personal reference books compiled during graduate school. Historical pigments and their chemical compositions, watermarks from the 15th century to the present, and binding techniques from various eras. I picked up the loupe. The cold metal felt familiar in my palm. I raised it to my eye and examined my skin. Every line, every pore became visible with merciless clarity. For 30 years, I had not used these tools. For 30 years, I had existed merely as a wife, then a mother, then a widow, a keeper of someone else's memory. But today at the cemetery, something had died and something long buried began to awaken. I carefully closed the box. I did not wipe the dust from the writing desk. Tomorrow, I would put things in order here, my order. The night passed without sleep. I did not lie awake, staring at the ceiling or revisiting old grievances in my memory. I sat in an armchair in silence, merely observing the toolbox sitting on my desk. I was not planning anything, nor constructing schemes for revenge. I was simply allowing the cold clarity to fill me to the brim, pushing everything else out, like an old dusty vessel finally emptied to be filled with something clean and transparent. I awoke with the first light. There was no haste, no familiar morning heaviness. I took a rag and a bucket of water, and for the first time in years began to tidy up my corner. I wiped the dust from the writing desk layer by layer until the texture of the old wood reemerged. I repotted the geraniums. I cleaned the glass on the small bookshelf that held my books, not Kwame's. They were not grand works, but modest monographs and collections of articles I had written before marriage. I looked at my name on the covers, Eva Jones, and felt as though I were meeting a long-lost acquaintance. I did not touch the rest of the apartment. The library, his desk, and his armchair all remained in their dusty, memorial neglect. But my little corner by the window now gleamed with cleanliness. It was my staging ground. The doorbell rang precisely at noon. This time, there was no hint of yesterday's false sorrow. It was short, businesslike, and impatient. They walked in without ceremony. Jabari did not even attempt to embrace me. His face was strained. Niara regarded me with barely concealed irritation. Their visit had one singular purpose. "Wilma, did you think about it?" Jabari asked right from the doorway as he walked into the living room. "Tea first?" I replied evenly. They exchanged glances. Their eyes read more of these old people's rituals, but they complied. They sat down, Jabari in his father's chair, Niara on the edge of the sofa, poised to leap up at any moment. I proceeded to the kitchen. My movements were slow and deliberate. I took out the tea leaves, poured boiling water, and sliced a lemon. I could hear them conversing in low tones in the living room. "She's stalling," Niara hissed. "Calm down. Where is she going to go?" Jabari retorted. "She'll drink her tea and sign everything." I placed the tray with the cups on the table. The porcelain clinked softly. I sat down opposite them in a simple wooden chair that usually resided in my kitchen. I did not sit in my customary place. I poured the tea. Jabari tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest. Niara picked up a cup but did not take a sip. "Ma, we don't have time for beating around the bush," Jabari began, breaking the silence. "We need an answer today. It's a large amount. We must get it done before the banks close." I took a small sip. The tea was hot and tart, burning my throat, but the cold remained inside. I looked up at them calmly, without judgment, merely observing them as if they were two strangers who had come to me on business. "Jabari, is your business," I began softly, as if pondering aloud, "related to antiques?" Jabari froze. His fingers ceased tapping. He gazed at me in surprise. "What?" he asked. "I was just reflecting on my old work," I continued evenly, regarding my cup. "Rare books, manuscripts. I was curious about what exactly you deal with. Import-export is rather vague." A silence fell, 1 second, another. Then Jabari laughed loudly, boisterously. It was not a cheerful laugh. It was the laugh of someone listening to a child's babbling. "Ma, please," he said, catching his breath. "Don't bore us with your old hobbies. What manuscripts? We're dealing with serious matters, logistics, supply chain. Do those words mean anything to you? What could you possibly know about any of this?" Niara did not laugh. She wore a quiet, pitying smile. She reached across the table and patted my hand condescendingly. Her fingers were cold. "Miss Johnson, dear," she purred, "you should be thinking about your health. Don't trouble yourself with things you don't understand. We'll handle all the details ourselves." She withdrew her hand and her gaze hardened. "Starting with the bank transfer. Jabari's right. We need to go." They stared at me, waiting. There was nothing in their eyes but greed and condescension. They perceived before them a quiet, senile old woman who had suddenly indulged in nostalgia. They mistook my calm for apathy and my inquiry as a sign of senility. In that moment, I comprehended that I possessed a weapon they did not even suspect, their own certainty of my nothingness. I watched the light from the window illuminate Nyara's face, highlighting the harsh crease by her lips. I observed the vein pulsing on Jabari's temple from impatience. I felt no pain from their words. Rather, I sensed something within me recalibrating, adjusting, like the optics in a precise instrument. I slowly placed the cup on the saucer. The sound seemed deafening again in the strained silence. "All right," I said, my voice even, perhaps even too weary. "I understand you." The relief on their faces was almost palpable. Jabari leaned back in his chair. Niara allowed herself a brief, triumphant smile. "I will need to review my assets," I added. Jabari immediately sat up straight. Of course," he nodded. "See what's in the accounts. Call the bank if you need to. We can wait for an hour." "No," I replied. "I need time. I will do it alone." I stood, signaling that the conversation was concluded. They were displeased by the delay, but confident in the outcome. They departed, throwing instructions over their shoulders regarding which bank, which account, and how best to execute the transfer to avoid extra questions. I nodded silently, escorting them to the door. Once the door closed behind them, I lingered for a moment in the silence, then returned, not to the phone to call the bank, but to my clean, gleaming writing desk. Their words, "What could you possibly know?" still hung in the air. They had erred. They had not only underestimated me, they had forgotten who I was, and I was just beginning to remember. I did not wait until evening. Picking up the phone, I located a number in an old address book, the direct line to the lodge at Pine Ridge Cemetery. The rings continued for an extended period. I thought no one would answer. "Hello," Ephraim's familiar low voice responded. "Ephraim, this is Eva Jones," I stated. My voice did not tremble. It was the calm, businesslike voice I had not used in 30 years. "I need to access the crypt tonight. Can you assist me?" A brief silence ensued, not one of surprise, but of contemplation. "Yes," he replied simply. "What time?" "When the gates are closed, when no one will be here." "Good, by the side gate. I will be waiting in 3 hours." He hung up. I placed the phone down. The first step had been taken. Night descended swiftly upon the city. I dressed entirely in black, taking only the toolbox wrapped in an old shawl and a small but powerful flashlight. I summoned a cab to the next street once more. A cemetery at night is an entirely different realm. By day, it is filled with quiet sorrow. Now it exudes a tense silence. The moon shone through the bare tree branches, casting strange skeletal shadows on the ground. At the side gate, just as promised, Ephraim awaited me. He resembled a shadow merged with the old brick wall. He silently unlocked the gate, let me in, and just as silently locked it again. We walked along the empty paths. I felt no fear. Strangely, I felt as though I belonged precisely here. Among the dead, I felt more alive than I had in years within my museum-like apartment. We approached the Johnson crypt. In the moonlight, it appeared even more massive and foreign. Ephraim retrieved a set of keys from his pocket, not the ones Jabari had. This was his work set. He did not rush to open it. He turned to me, his face in the semi-darkness stern and deeply saddened. "Miss Jones," he began quietly, and in his I heard deep, long-standing respect. "Your husband, Kwame Johnson, was more than just a man to me. A long time ago, when my family was on the streets, he was the only one who extended a hand. He financed my education at the history department at Morehouse College. He saved us." He paused, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I have been observing your son for 6 months with disgust. I witnessed how he turned his father's grave into a public thoroughfare. Initially, I thought it was merely some of his shady dealings. However, I began listening and taking notes." He reached into his coat and produced a small, worn notebook with a dark cover. "Everything is documented here," he stated. "Dates, times of meetings, license plate numbers of the cars that arrived here, snippets of conversations I managed to overhear. I did it for Kwame, for his memory. I was uncertain how to proceed, and then yesterday, you came. I took the notebook. It felt heavy, not due to the weight of the paper, but from the burden of betrayal encapsulated within its pages. I did not open it. I simply gripped it tightly in my hand. "Thank you, Ephraim," I said quietly. He nodded, and in that simple gesture, I felt more understanding and alliance than I had in my entire life. He inserted the key into the lock. The grinding of the metal sounded like a scream. The door yielded, releasing a waft of cold, damp air and the dust of centuries. "The spot is here," Ephraim indicated, pointing to one of the marble slabs on the wall to the left of the sarcophagus. It was indistinguishable from the others. "Press here and here simultaneously near the bottom. It will shift." He handed me the crypt's heavy key. "Lock yourself in from the inside. I'll be nearby. When you're finished, simply open the door. I'll hear it." He left, dissolving into the shadows. I stepped inside, turning the massive key in the lock on the inside of the door. Click, I was alone. I switched on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated Kwame's stone sarcophagus from the darkness, dusty and forgotten. I walked over to the wall Ephraim had indicated. I located two barely noticeable indentations at the bottom of the slab. I pressed. There was a quiet click, and the slab moved easily aside, revealing a dark niche, the hidden compartment. Carefully laid out inside were several objects wrapped in dark crimson velvet. I took one, the largest, placed it on the sarcophagus lid, and unwrapped it. It was an old icon on a dark wooden board, the Savior not made by hands. The face was painted with astonishing finesse, conveying deep, all-forgiving sorrow in the eyes. The golden background glimmered dimly in the flashlight's beam, the varnish darkened by time, the net of perfect craquelure, and the tiny chips in the wood all spoke of authenticity. A master's work, a true masterpiece capable of gracing any museum. I set my toolbox beside it and opened it. My fingers instinctively found the familiar tools. First, the loop. I held it up to the icon. My eye, my brain, my memory, all operated as one smooth mechanism. 30 years of inactivity vanished as if they had never existed. I was myself once more. I examined every millimeter, the brushstrokes, the composition of the ground visible in the chips, the method of securing the splines on the reverse side. Everything was nearly flawless. I retrieved the UV lamp. In its eerie violet light, the old varnish should have emitted an even yellowish-green glow. It did, yet, when I swept the beam over the folds of the Savior's robe where the artist had employed lead white to depict the light, I observed what I had been searching for. In the brightest spots, the glow was different. Brighter, colder, almost chalky. It was a tiny foreign fluorescence, the fluorescence of titanium dioxide. In its anatase form, this pigment was not patented until the early 20th century. Employing it in an icon passed off as a 15th century work could only be executed by someone who was entirely confident in their genius and the buyer's blindness. A masterful forgery, brilliant, yet with one tiny, arrogant mistake that could only be made by one man. In the cold silence of the crypt, I suddenly remembered his name very clearly. The brilliant restorer who had been shamefully expelled from the National Institute of Expertise for unethical copying experiments. A man obsessed with creating the perfect fake, Anatol Voronov. I will keep this name as he is an external character, not part of the main black family, and a specialist. Often, non-local specialists are hired. I recognized the forger, and I understood what I had to do now. I carefully replaced the icon in the velvet, folded the tools back into the box. The quiet click of the lock resonated in the dead silence, like a period marking the end of a long sentence. I returned everything to the hidden compartment, sliding the slab back into place. It settled silently, leaving no trace, as if I had never been there. I turned the key, and the heavy crypt door groaned open, allowing a sliver of the night sky and a gust of fresh, cold air to enter. Ephraim was waiting for me at the entrance like a silent guardian. I silently held out his key and the one he had given me. He took them, nodding just as silently. We needed no words. He understood everything from my expression. He turned and walked to lead me to the exit. His shadow glided ahead, pointing the way. The journey home passed like a fog. The city was beginning to awaken. Occasional cars sped through the streets, sanitation workers cleaned the sidewalks, while I rode in the cab, clutching Ephraim's worn notebook in my pocket, feeling the icy resolve born yesterday on the hill by the old fence harden and temper within me. It was not anger. It was the sensation of a surgeon making a precise diagnosis, knowing the operation would be complex but necessary. I did not call the police. That would be too simple, too noisy, and it would not restore Kwam's desecrated honor. The police would punish the criminals, but I had to destroy the lie itself, the web they had so skillfully spun. To accomplish that, I needed to strike not at their hands, but at the very center of the web. Back in the apartment, I did not lie down. I brewed myself strong black coffee and sat at my clean, tidy writing desk. The first rays of the sun touched my window. Yesterday, the anniversary had concluded. A new day of action had begun. On the desk lay an old telephone directory with numbers I had not used for decades. I found the one I needed, Paul K. Stevens, director of the Atlanta Museum of Art. I recalled him as a young, ambitious graduate student who often visited us, looking at Kwame with reverence. I dialed the number. My fingers did not. Director's office, a cheerful woman's voice answered. Hello. Please connect me with Mr. Stevens. I'm calling about an urgent matter. He's in a meeting. What is this concerning? Tell him it's Eva Jones. I'm sorry. How did you spell that? I repeated it slowly, enunciating each syllable. Eva Johnson Jones, the wife of the late Kwame Johnson. The woman on the other end hesitated. My husband's name still carried weight in these circles. One moment, please, she said, her tone shifting to one that was more respectful. I waited, listening to the wall clock tick, counting the seconds of my old life. Eva Johnson Jones. Paul Stevens's voice resonated exactly as I remembered, deep, slightly velvety, with notes of self-satisfaction. What a pleasant surprise. It's been so many years. Please accept my deepest condolences for your loss, dear. Kwame was a beacon for all of us. He recited the obligatory words, polite and empty, expecting me to start asking for something, to complain, to reminisce. Paul, hello, I replied calmly. I'm calling not only as the widow of Kwame Johnson, but also as the former senior archivist of the National Institute of Expertise. A silence hung on the other end, short but telling. The meeting apparently ended instantly. I'm listening, Eva. All the velvety condescension vanished from his voice, replaced by wariness. I have recently learned that your museum plans to acquire a valuable exhibit soon, the 15th century Psalter, if I am not mistaken, from a certain private collection. Silence again, longer this time. He had not anticipated that. That information is for internal use, he said cautiously. How do you have this knowledge? The source is irrelevant at this moment, I continued evenly. What matters is this. I can state with almost 100% certainty that you are being deceived. The Psalter being offered to you is a high-grade forgery. But we had experts. Panic and outrage laced his voice. The preliminary conclusion was absolutely positive. Your experts weren't searching for what they needed to look for, I hypothesized. The white pigment used to detail the initials contains the anatase form of titanium dioxide, a chemical anachronism. This pigment could not have existed in the 15th century. Check it, and you will see for yourself. As I spoke, I heard my own voice from outside. It was not the voice of Eva the widow or Eva the mother. It was the voice of Jones, the expert who tolerates no doubt. Paul Stevens fell silent. I could almost physically sense the thoughts racing through his mind. A blow to his reputation, a scandal, the loss of state funding. Titanium dioxide, he muttered, almost in a daze. But who? Who is capable of such a thing? I believe you already know the answer, Paul, I replied, delivering the final blow. Remember who was expelled from the Institute about 20 years ago for handling copies too loosely? Remember Anatol Voronov? That name acted as an electric shock. Voronov? God, I thought he drank himself to death somewhere. As you can see, no, his talent has found a new application. Paul, I strongly urge you to immediately halt the deal and conduct a full independent forensic analysis before it is too late. Yes, of course, Eva, I am in your debt. I will cancel everything immediately. We must meet later, I interrupted him. First, do what you must. Goodbye. I hung up. The apartment was quiet once more, but the silence felt different. It no longer oppressed me. It hummed with tension like a taut string. I knew that right now, In the museum director's office, phones were ringing, orders were being given, and the nearly signed contract was flying into the wastebasket. I envisioned Jabari's face when the buyer called him. I imagined Niara's panic upon realizing that their biggest score, the very money they intended to use to pay off their unreliable partners, had vanished, turned to smoke. I stood up and walked to the window. The day was breaking. Their easy money was gone. Their creditors, I was certain, would not be inclined to wait. The clock on the wall continued ticking, now counting down to the impending explosion. I intended to wait for it right here in my staging ground, tranquil and composed. 2 days passed. 2 days of deafening, tense silence. They did not contact me. They did not visit. I knew this was the calm before the storm. They were attempting to figure out what had transpired, trying to salvage their deal, to reach out to their accomplices. But I had severed the main thread in their web, and now the entire structure was collapsing, burying them beneath it. I was not idle. I dedicated these 2 days to reorganization. With Ephraim's assistance, who came to check on me under the pretense of fixing a leaky faucet, we executed a small revolution in my apartment. We repositioned Kwame's massive oak desk against the wall. It was no longer the center of this universe. It became just a piece of furniture. In the center of the living room, in the spot where my husband's desk had reigned, I placed my writing desk, my small, modest, yet now shining clean workspace. I brought the books that had been gathering dust on the shelves from my bedroom. My books, the very monographs and reference guides. I spread them around me on the desk and chairs. I took out Ephraim's notebook and began making notes on a large sheet of butcher paper. License plate numbers, dates, names I managed to decipher. What emerged was a diagram, a map of their criminal life. For the first time in years, this apartment ceased to be a mausoleum. It transformed into an office. My office. On the third day, they arrived. I knew it was them even before the knock. More accurately, it was not a knock. It was a furious, aggressive pounding. They were hitting the door with their fists. I did not rush. I carefully set down my pen and closed the notebook. I stood up and walked slowly to the door. The sound of the blows intensified. Jabari's voice, distorted by rage, added to the cacophony. "Mom, open up. I know you're home. Open it right now." I turned the key in the lock. The door flew open so abruptly that it struck the wall. They burst into the hallway like two predators, their faces twisted by a blend of fear and hatred. Yesterday's condescension and the day before's false sorrow peeled away like cheap gold plating, revealing an ugly, greedy core. "What have you done?" Jabari roared, advancing toward me. His eyes were red and crazed. "What did you say to whom? The deal is off. We have been burned. The buyer is gone. It was you. You ruined everything. You destroyed us," he shouted, spitting saliva. Previously, I would have flinched in fear, burst into tears, and begun justifying myself. But now I simply stood and looked at him calmly, like a doctor observing a patient having a fit. I silently turned and walked back into the living room, sitting down at my desk and picking up my pen. He followed me, continuing his shouting. "I'm talking to you. Look at me." I dipped the pen into the inkwell and wrote down another license plate number from Ephraim's notebook on the paper. I did not look at him. "Destroyed you?" I asked quietly, not lifting my gaze from the paper. My voice, in the midst of his hysteria, resonated with a calmness that felt deafening. "Or exposed you?" Jabari fell silent for a moment, thrown off by my tone. "What? What are you saying? What exposure? Have you lost your mind, old woman?" "I'm merely consulting," I continued just as quietly, drawing a line from the license plate number to the date of the meeting. "Imagine, the museum finds my old hobbies very valuable, much more valuable than your import-export." Then I looked up at them, first at Jabari, then at Naara. I observed as the realization dawned on them, disbelief transforming into horror in their eyes. They looked at me and no longer saw their quiet, harmless, senile mother or an accessory to the apartment and the pension. They saw a woman seated at her working desk in the center of the room, a woman with a straight back and a cold, clear, absolutely calm gaze, the gaze of an expert delivering a final verdict. They saw Eva Jones, the archivist, whom they had buried and forgotten 30 years ago. "You," Jabari whispered. He took a step back. All his fury had drained away, leaving behind only sticky, primal fear. "You called the museum. I did not respond. I merely continued to look at him. You used his grave as a warehouse, Jabari, I stated. My voice, though quiet, filled the entire room. There was no pity in it, only a statement of fact. You traded in forgeries from your father's crypt. You dragged his name, his legacy, and his entire life through the mud for money. I paused, allowing the words to permeate the silence. There is nothing left to destroy here. These words lingered in the air, final and inevitable, like a sentence. Jabari gazed at me, and there was no longer rage in his eyes, only empty, childlike terror. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish thrown onto the bank, but could not utter a sound. He sought salvation, support, but upon turning to his wife, he saw only cold, calculated panic. Niara had already regained her composure. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something else, nasty, venomous resolve. She was not looking at me. She was looking through me, already calculating her next move. She grasped Jabari's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Let's go," she hissed. "It's futile to converse with her. She's not right in the head." She dragged him toward the exit. He walked, stumbling, his glazed eyes fixed on me. Before disappearing behind the door, Niara turned around, and in her glare, I discerned everything. This is not over. This is a declaration of war. They left. I remained seated at my desk in the ensuing silence. I understood that Niara would not relent. Like a wounded snake, she would writhe and strike until the end. I had to prepare for her blow. It came 2 days later. My neighbor, Miss Anime, called me, her voice trembling with outrage. "Eva, did you see tonight's Gossip Hound? Sit down before you read it." I did not subscribe to the tabloids. I went to the convenience store and purchased the cheap, foul-smelling sheet. On page 3, beneath the screaming headline, "Widow's Grief or Senior Insanity," I saw my picture, an old one taken about 10 years ago at some anniversary. Next to it was a photo of Jabari and Niara posing as a loving, suffering couple. The article was a masterpiece of lies and manipulation. An anonymous source close to the family recounted a heartbreaking story: how the poor widow of the esteemed academic Kwame Johnson, Eva Johnson Jones, had never recovered following her husband's death. The piece claimed that I had retreated into myself, began rambling, confusing reality with fiction, and how, in my deranged state, I had fabricated a monstrous story to tarnish the reputation of my only son and his wife, who were devoted to my care. There were insinuations that I might have even connected with some con artists myself and was now attempting to shift the blame onto my children. The final chord was especially vile. It's possible the elderly woman, obsessed with antiques, is herself the mastermind of a criminal ring, and her accusations are merely a way to eliminate competitors or ease her own conscience. This was their last desperate maneuver, to make me appear insane, to discredit me in the eyes of anyone who might believe me. They struck at my weakest point, my age and my loneliness. The calculation was simple. Who would believe a heartbroken old widow over a successful young couple? I finished the article, folded the newspaper, and felt nothing. No offense, no anger, only cold contempt. They believed they were playing chess, but in reality, they had merely overturned the board, thereby signing their final sentence. I dialed Paul Stevens's number. Museum director speaking. "Paul, it's Eva Jones. Did you read tonight's Gossip Hound?" A heavy sigh emanated from the other end. "I did, Eva. What garbage. I was just about to call you. My lawyers—" "Your lawyers will not be necessary," I interrupted. "I have a better idea. I think it's time for the museum to announce its new acquisition. Not the Psalter, but something far more valuable." An hour later, I was in the director's office. Ephraim's notebook lay on the table before me. Paul, the museum's security chief, and I leaned over it. I calmly and methodically explained what each entry, each date, and each license plate number indicated. I demonstrated my diagram. I discussed the chemical composition of pigments, techniques for artificially aging wood, and how to forge watermarks on paper. I spoke, and they listened, their faces growing increasingly serious. There was no longer condescension in the director's eyes. There was respect and eagerness from a professional who had sensed a major prize. "They declared war," he said, closing the notebook, "so they will receive one. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the museum's large conference room, we are calling a press conference." The following day, the hall was packed. Journalists from every major publication, television cameras, flashes, Like a buzzing hive, they anticipated a scandal. I sat in the front row. Ephraim sat beside me, dressed in a plain yet well-maintained suit. He was as calm as a rock. Paul Stevens approached the podium, exuding authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending," he began. "The museum has convened you today for a very important reason. As you know, our primary mission is the preservation of cultural heritage, and today we wish to announce a new vital step in this direction." He paused. "We are introducing a new position to our staff, a special consultant for antiquities and authenticity. It is with immense honor that I present the individual who will hold this post, someone whose name is synonymous with impeccable reputation and the highest level of professionalism in this field. Please welcome Eva Johnson." He turned and looked at me. Silence enveloped the hall for a second, followed by sparse, confused applause. Journalists exchanged glances. The author of yesterday's Gossip Hound article dropped their pen. I stood and walked to the podium. I surveyed the hall, the camera flashes, the dozens of curious eyes, and began to speak calmly, clearly, without notes. I discussed titanium dioxide, the difference in the glow of old and new varnish under ultraviolet light. I spoke not as a victim or a deranged old woman, but as an expert delivering a lecture. The hall fell silent. They listened, holding their breath. "And now," I concluded, "I would like you to hear from the man whose courage and dedication to my husband's memory helped prevent a major theft from the public purse. Ephraim." Ephraim walked up to the podium and placed his worn notebook upon it. "I merely did what I had to do," he stated quietly but firmly. At that very moment, while the cameras focused on Ephraim's notebook, 2 unmarked cars pulled up to the home of my son and his wife. They were just finishing packing their bags. The door was opened for them, not by them. The door was opened with a detective's key. When the press conference concluded, Paul's assistant approached me. "Miss Jones," he whispered, "we just received word. They were apprehended while attempting to flee." I heard those words and felt nothing resembling triumph. There was neither joy nor glee, only silence, a deep, deafening silence that followed a long, exhausting noise. I slowly nodded to the assistant, accepting the news as a given, like a doctor's conclusion. Paul immediately stepped between me and the journalists who were closing in with new questions. "That's all for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you." His voice sounded like a gavel closing an auction. He took my arm and, ignoring the murmurs, led me through the service exit away from the chaos. From that day forward, my life changed. Not dramatically, but it began anew. The first thing I did upon returning home was throw open all the windows wide. I took down the heavy, dusty drapes that had hung there for decades, allowing the sun and air to enter the apartment. The rooms filled with light, revealing that they were not so gloomy after all. The dust dancing in the sunbeams no longer appeared as a symbol of oblivion. It was merely dust that needed to be wiped away. The apartment transformed. It ceased to be a mausoleum for one great man. It became a living workspace for another. Kwame's books still occupied the shelves, but now my own appeared beside them. On his desk, left against the wall as a tribute, there was now a vase of fresh flowers, not stacks of old manuscripts. And my writing desk, situated in the center of the room, hummed with a quiet, active life. It was cluttered with books, printouts, and photographs of antiques sent for appraisal from all over the country. The air no longer smelled of tobacco and decay. It was infused with the scent of lemon polish, freshly brewed coffee, and the printer's ink of new catalogs. The phone rang sharply and demandingly. I sat at the desk, examining a photograph of an enameled locket through my loupe. The phone rang again, insistent. "Jones." "Hello, Miss Jones. This is the Legacy Auction House. We're calling about that Fabre cigarette case. We have documents confirming the provenance. Very solid paperwork." I chuckled to myself. Paperwork is the easiest thing to fake. "Is the master's hallmark authentic?" I inquired. "Absolutely perfect." "It's too perfect, young man," I replied, pushing the photograph aside. My voice was calm and firm. Carl Faber had an apprentice during that period with a slight vision defect. He always set the hallmark slightly tilted to the right by fractions of a millimeter. Yours is set as if by a ruler. It's modern work done using old sketches. Very good work, but work nonetheless. No, the provenance is fake. Please inform your client of this. A stunned silence lingered on the other end. I had made my point. I hung up the phone and picked up the loop once more. Twice a week, I led seminars at the museum for young curators and art history students. I stood in the bright, spacious hall before a dozen eager faces, hungry for knowledge. They regarded me not as an elderly woman, but as a source of knowledge absent from any textbook. They hung on my every word. Never trust first impressions, I advised them, holding an ancient reliquary. Beauty can deceive. History can deceive. Even science can be manipulated to deceive. Yet the object itself, the thing, never lies. You just have to learn to listen to its quiet voice. Look here at this scroll work. Do you see how the light plays on the patina? It lies too evenly. Real time is merciless. It leaves scars, wear, traces of human touch. Here there exists only the flawless work of a chemist. I gazed into their shining eyes and understood. This was it. This was the true legacy, not in granite and marble, but in the transmission of knowledge, in igniting the spark of love for authenticity within them, just as Kwame had once ignited it in me. Today, following the seminar, I did not head straight home. The day was surprisingly warm and sunny. I purchased a bouquet of white lilies and drove to Pine Ridge Cemetery. Everything here was different too. Sunlight filtered through the foliage, and the shadows no longer appeared sinister. They simply offered coolness. I walked along the familiar path, and my heart felt quiet and peaceful. I approached our crypt. The granite door was closed forever. I knew that everything inside had been set in order now. There were no more hidden compartments or foreign objects, only peace. I placed the flowers on the cold stone. The white lilies stood out brightly against the dark granite. I ran my palm over the engraved letters. Kwame Johnson. I did not feel the sharp, cutting pain that had haunted me all those years. Only a gentle, quiet sadness and gratitude remained. Well, Kwame, I whispered, everything is right now. Everything is in its place. I lingered for a moment longer, inhaling the scent of the flowers and decaying leaves. I was not here as a widow mourning her loss. I was here as a woman who had reclaimed her name, her dignity, and her future. Turning to leave, I spotted Ephraim's figure in the distance at the turn of the path. He was sweeping the driveway. He noticed me, stopped, and simply nodded once, solemnly and respectfully. I nodded back at him. It was our silent salute, the salute of two custodians. I walked toward the exit, the sun shining on my back. I was no longer the shadow of my great husband, nor the mother of my fallen son. I was Eva Jones, and my liberation was complete. Thus concludes the story of Eva Jones, a narrative of a quiet woman who was overlooked for decades by those closest to her, who took her love and self-sacrifice for granted. This tale encompasses not only a profound betrayal, but also incredible inner strength, which, like an old tool that has not lost its power, can be revived. Eva discovered the courage not only to punish the guilty, but also to reconstruct her life entirely, reclaiming her name, respect, and right to a future. Her story serves as a reminder that it is never too late to remember who you truly are. However, her choice was incredibly difficult. Do you believe she acted correctly by handing her own son over to justice? Was it cold revenge, or was it the only appropriate means to protect her husband's legacy and her own honor? Could she, as a mother, have sought another path, attempted to forgive or save him differently? And would you like to know what transpired next in Eva's life? How did her new career unfold? Did Jabari ever try to contact her after everything that transpired? Your thoughts are very important to us. If you have any questions regarding this story, or are simply curious about any details that were left unaddressed, please share them in the comments. Please like this video if the story resonated with you, and subscribe to our channel to ensure you do not miss new captivating tales. Your feedback is the best reward for our work. We wish you all the best. Did you enjoy the story? Which city are you listening from? Let's engage in the comments. If you appreciated the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, enabling me to continue sharing more stories like this. Thank you for your kind support. I eagerly await your comments on the story. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.